God's love for humanity is so great and wonderful. It is beyond what our senses can fathom. Personally, I have come to realize that the errors of man have never stopped God from accomplishing his purposes on earth. King David looked at how great the love of God for humanity was, and he wrote in Psalm 8, 3-4, "When I consider thy heavens, the work of thy fingers, the moon and the stars, which thou hast ordained, what is man, that thou art mindful of him, and the Son of Man, that thou visiteth him? As great as the disobedience and rebellion of man is against God, God has never looked away from the entire human race to wipe us out. After Adam and Eve sinned in the Garden of Eden, they discovered that they were naked because the initial glory of God that covered them was stripped off by sin. Yet, God could not look away from them. Rather, he clothed their nakedness. Again, when the wickedness of the entire human race multiplied greatly, and God was to flood off the earth, he found a man with whom he will continue his purposes, Noah and his family. All through the scriptures, God has always prevailed over people's disobedience. Even in mankind's disobedience, God always has a plan. God is always in control. Nothing surprises God. Nothing catches God off guard. A very good example in the Bible of a man who God used his disobedience to teach him a great lesson and to correct him was the prophet Jonah. Jonah chapter 1 verse 2-3 says, "Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and cry against it, for their wickedness is come up before me." But Jonah rose up to flee unto Tarshish from the presence of the Lord, and went down to Joppa, and found a ship going down to Tarsus. So he paid the fare thereof, and went down into it to go with them unto Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. Ordinarily, we know the prophets are the messengers of God. But this time, Jonah was set to disobey God willingly. The message God gave Jonah was very clear, and he was not in doubt about it. Yet he chose to disobey. Although there is never any good reason for anyone to disobey God, Jonah chapter 4 verse 2, "And he prayed unto the Lord and said, I pray thee, O Lord, was not this my saying when I was yet in my country? Therefore I fled before unto Tarshish. For I knew that thou art a gracious God and merciful, slow to anger, and of great kindness, and repentest thee of the evil." In essence, Jonah wanted Nineveh to experience the full wrath of God without limit. He didn't want his enemies to experience the mercy and love of God he had come to experience. This is the wonderful thing about the gospel message. The gospel message is not only for a select few, but the gospel message is for all men and women, regardless of ethnicity, background, and social status. So instead of going to Nineveh to proclaim the message of God, Jonah wanted to escape to Tarshish. He wanted to flee from the presence of God. Like Jonah, this is how many believers have been disobedient to the instructions of God, even when they are sure what God told them. It is very dangerous to be disobedient to God because such people will learn their lessons in a hard way. The fact is that God knows your next move before you take it, so you cannot get away with your disobedience because he knows what is going on in your heart even before you act. Jonah thought he could escape from the presence of God. He probably did not know that God is omnipresent. God is everywhere, and he doesn't struggle to get hold of anyone. As Jonah was planning to run to Tarshish, God was preparing how to meet him. God had already provided a whale that would swallow Jonah. He made a room in the belly of the whale. No one can escape from the presence of God. He is in control of all things, and he can use nature to accomplish his purposes. As Jonah confidently slept in the ship that fostered his disobedience, God caused a great storm to arise against the ship and all the people on shore. You see, many believers are currently experiencing waves in their lives, career, ministry, marriage, etc., because they are being disobedient to what God told them. The worst thing about disobeying God's instructions is that disobedience puts the people around us into trouble. When we disobey God, other people will suffer along with us. Adam and Eve disobeyed God, and the entire human race suffered for it. Jonah's disobedience made all the people with him to lose their valuables as they cast them into the sea to lighten the ship. Jonah chapter 2, verse 1 through 2. Then Jonah prayed unto the Lord his God out of the fish's belly, and said, I cried by reason of mine afflictions unto the Lord, and he heard me. Out of the belly of hell cried I, and thou heardest my voice. If you have been disobedient to God, you have to repent like Jonah and ask the Lord for mercy. Jonah was compelled to obey what God instructed him to do. Finally, Jonah was vomited by the whale at the shore of Nineveh, where he was running away from. God transported Jonah by whale to the place of his assignment. This implies that God's blueprint for a man will never change. The man may stray off in disobedience, but God's plan remains intact until he or she comes back to his or her senses. God is calling us back to himself by this message so that we will not linger in the belly of the fish. It is dangerous not to repent and take responsibility for the instructions God gave us as soon as we are convicted of our disobedience. Delayed disobedience is very dangerous. It is equal to disobedience. Choosing to obey God only when his instructions seem rational to us is also another form of disobedience which we must avoid. Anyone who can journey successfully with God must have his or her senses suspended to follow God. Disobedience does not have a good end. We must therefore desist from it. It is better to obey God than to learn to obey God through his hard lessons of disobedience. Disobedience is very likened to rebellion. And what does the Bible say about rebellion? God looks at this sin so strongly that he compared it to witchcraft. 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 22 through 23. And Samuel said, Hath the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices, as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to hearken than the fat of rams. For rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft, and stubbornness is as iniquity and idolatry. Because thou hast rejected the word of the Lord, he hath rejected thee from being king. Samuel's comparison of rebellion to witchcraft can initially appear strange at first, since rebellion and magic arts appear to have little or nothing in common. However, the comparison is not focused on the kinds of sins they represent, but on their magnitude. Rebellion is just as bad as witchcraft. Disregarding God's clear commands is just as spiritually dangerous as getting involved in demonism.